I'm a huge believer that entrepreneurs need to acknowledge the role of luck in their successes. If you think about it, I mean, our business has been around for 18 years. I think we've been down to call it under 3 months of cash, maybe a dozen times, something like that. If you think about our job in management, our job is to have, plan A for how you're going to manage through plan B, plan C, et cetera. Effectively, you're trying to load the dice, right? You're trying to make sure that when you're rolling the dice, you're not going to roll snake eyes. But even if you've got a 95% chance of getting through each one of those potential failure points, that's a 5% chance the first time and 5% chance the second time and a 5% chance the third time. By the time you've done that 12 times, you're much more likely to have gone under than not, even if you had a 95% chance of getting through each of those potential failure points. And 95% means you've done an amazing job of managing the risk profile of the business. So I think successful entrepreneurs should show some humility.
From laboccupier.com, this is NGB Ideas, a podcast about the personal journey of leaders in Canada's life sciences community. Hi, I'm your host, Jim Wilson, and my guest today is Darren Anderson, who's the CEO and co-founder of Vive Crop Protection, which is one of the leading agri-tech companies in Canada. The idea behind Vive Crop Protection is to help growers do more with less. By focusing on development over discovery, Darren and his team are able to create unique products by combining synthetic chemistry with bio-based pesticides. These products have higher performance, are more trusted by growers, they lower cost, and they're better for the environment. Before we get to our conversation with Darren, we'd like to let you know this podcast is part of Next Great Big Ideas, Canada's Life Sciences Summit. NGBI is an independently organized annual fundraising event in support of McMaster Children's Hospital, and you can find details at nextgreatbigideas.com. This episode of NGB Ideas was recorded in November 2024. Darren Anderson, welcome to NGB Ideas.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you, and we were just chatting before we went live that I'm really looking forward to this conversation because you've lived a really interesting life. You grew up in the Sarnia area before moving to Toronto, but you weren't born in Sarnia. Where were you born?
I was born in Huntington, West Virginia.
How did you end up going from there to here?
So it more of just an accident of history than anything else. My parents moved to Huntington to support the construction of a refining facility, but they're Canadian and my family has been in Canada for a long time. So it was more of a temporary thing, but happened to be born while they were in West Virginia, but certainly grew up, at least until I was in high school, in the Sarnia area.
Okay, so you're dual citizen.
Yeah.
You grew up initially in the Sarnia area. Were you in town or were you in the outskirts? Because there's a lot of farming in that neck of the woods.
There is, although I didn't really touch it all that much. So I grew up around farming. I have family members primarily on my dad's side that had farms, and we would visit them every summer. And I used to do a lot of fishing with my grandfather that was often on farmland and that type of thing. But really mostly grew up, I was in Sarnia proper till I was probably about 10, and then we moved to Corunna, which is a small town 20 minutes from Sarnia, and was there until we moved to the Toronto area when I was about 15.
Yeah. Now, were your parents born in the Sarnia area?
Yeah, they grew up in Sarnia. So it's really interesting. They've also kind of come full circle. They grew up in Sarnia. It's obviously where I grew up, as well as my two sisters. And then we moved to the Toronto area when I was in high school, and they spent their careers mostly in the Toronto area, and now they're actually back retired in Sarnia. So I will be back in Sarnia visiting them at Christmas this year. It's just funny how that sometimes happens.
Very cool. I'm sorry, what are their names?
Jim and Marilyn. And then I have two sisters, Lauren and Leslie, and my grandmother is also still in Sarnia. She turned 95 earlier this year, which is cool.
Wow, good for her. I hope she's in good health and spirits.
She is. She's in an amazing place.
So what did your parents do for a living?
So my dad was general business at Imperial Oil. So folks might recognize it as SO, but did a variety of roles there, including a bunch of the early IT projects as they implemented things like SAP. And my mother was an entrepreneur. So she started a business doing personal training when we moved to the Toronto area. And well, she was doing some of it while we were in Sarnia, but really got started when we moved to the Toronto area. And this was back before there were, personal trainers at every gym, and it was such a common thing. This was back before any of that. And she started her own business, personal training, with a variety of clients in the part of Toronto that we were in, which was Aurora, up north of the city, and absolutely loved it until she retired.
Well, good for her. So I'm guessing that's where you got your entrepreneurial spirit.
Well, it's funny you say that because that had never occurred to me. And I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit, but my academic career started the company. And I remember at one point talking to my PhD supervisor, who said she had been convinced from the moment I walked into her lab that I was going to start a company, which was hilarious because I had no such thoughts. It was never something that had really crossed my mind. But it was very funny because I always started things, right? So when I was in college, I started a couple of different student groups. And so when I was between undergrad and grad school, I set up a tutoring business.
We're going to
So
talk
it's
about
absolutely
that. Yeah.
consistent, but it was never something that occurred to me. And it's I don't know, maybe I picked up some entrepreneurial spirit through osmosis. I think part of it though, myself, my two sisters, I think we come by this from my parents. We're pretty independent. It's a big part of what drives us is the ability to kind of drive our own lives. And I think that desire for independence and having an impact on the world does tend to encourage a bit of an entrepreneurial mindset.
Now, you mentioned you have two sisters. You're in the middle, correct?
No, I'm the oldest, but we're a very close family, and they're awesome, and we still spend a lot of time together.
Oh, that's great. So you moved up to Aurora when you were 15, so just starting out high school. Before we move on to the next chapter of your life, I'd like to talk a bit about your high school years. Where did you go to high school?
I went to high school at Aurora High School, which was one of the two high schools in Aurora. Really enjoyed it. It was a very, very good place to spend my my high school years.
Now, were you a gregarious kid? And did you have a lot of friends and play a lot of sports? Or what kind of teenager were you?
I've always been extroverted, but I wouldn't say that I was necessarily the most outgoing or popular kid. When I moved to Aurora, I ended up joining Aurora High School at the time. I don't know if they still do, but they had an enriched program. There were a lot of kids that I got along with really, really well. And so I ended up having a pretty fun high school period, ran for student council and, did track and field. But I've always been active from a physical perspective, but it's not like I've been particularly gifted. So it wasn't like I played a bunch of sports at like a super competitive level. I've never been good enough, which is frustrating given that I'm, as most entrepreneurs are, pretty darn.
So now in I guess it was grade 11, you had a chemistry teacher who kind of turned you on to chemistry. Who was that?
That is correct. So my grade 11 chemistry teacher was Mr. Steep, and he had such an interesting life. And I don't remember all the details of it, but like he worked as an ambulance driver for a while and like had done a bunch of overseas stuff. I'd never done any traveling when I was younger. So just a ton of that kind of thing. And when I took chemistry with him in grade 11, it was such a cool experience because he really emphasized the impact that chemistry has, for good or ill, on the world. And so, he talked about the fact that during the 70s, I guess it was, when synthetic flavors were developed, that actually put a bunch of the old mom and pop ice cream shops out of business because they couldn't compete with the synthetic flavors. And so you ended up getting this kind of commoditization and corporatization of ice cream. He talked about, the revolution of synthetic plastics and how much of an impact that had been from a positive point of view. He talked about, new medicines. Like, it was every lesson he made it real around really the impact. And it was really interesting because I think that resonated for me, having grown up just outside of Sarnia And then it's also it was the heart of the biggest concentration of chemical refining capability in North America. Imperial Oil, Polysar, Nova, a ton and it's still there. It's called the Chemical Mile. And so growing up there, the reality of making all of these products that had a major impact on people around the world, I think that also, I picked that up a bit by osmosis. And I think that's
Okay.
driven a lot of how I think about the world today. Going back to my chemistry class in high school, that just kind of brought that full circle.
Now, were you a good student in high school?
Yeah, I was a pretty good student.
Yeah, well,
I always have been. I've always enjoyed learning, and that type of stuff has typically come pretty naturally to me on the science side.
now you graduated from high school in the spring of 1997, and that September you started at the University of Toronto, where you pursued a Bachelor of Sciences degree in chemical physics. And Darren, I don't have a science background, and I haven't the faintest idea what chemical physics is all about. So I'd appreciate you taking a moment to explain to our listeners, but mostly to me, what chemical physics means.
Easiest way to understand it is it was basically a major in chemistry, a major in physics, and a minor in math. I mean, honestly, it's really, chemical physics is about understanding the physical properties and forces that drive how chemical bonds are made and broken. And so that can include how chemical reactions happen if somebody's trying to synthesize a new drug, but it also includes how chemicals interact with their environment and like how they would stick to a surface or move in the environment, which ended up being quite relevant as I went on to do my master's and my PhD.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you were involved in a bunch of things at the University of Toronto, one of which was the Chemistry Students' Union, and
Mhm.
you were also involved in the Arts and Sciences Students' Union. What roles did you have?
Yeah, so Chemistry Students Union ran for about a year. So this is the undergraduate student group that really just was responsible for trying to. The University of Toronto is a big university. You get a lot of students from all over, and it's all about trying to make them feel like they have a home. I think in a lot of faculties, think about engineers, there's like this whole pride of being an engineer that didn't exist as much in arts and science. And so that was part of what I was doing at the Chemical Students Union. And then it was the same at the Arts and Science Students Union, which was, again, just about trying to make it feel a little bit less like it was 100 different programs and a little bit more like it was a community. And I actually started another students group while I was there as well, that was really about trying to build that sense of community inside the Faculty of Science. Although I will also characterize it as we sometimes described it internally as a way to try to get money from the university administration we could spend on beer, which was successful.
Now, this was in the late 80s, and I
Mhm.
guess the university was coming off like a 10-year moratorium on clamping down on freshman orientation. Why was do you know why the orientation program was shut down for that period of time?
They were still. I mean, they were still doing freshman orientations. We were
Okay.
certainly I still had one when I went to university in 1997. So they were still happening. I think there'd been a lot of recognition of just some of the, let's say, the excesses and bad behavior that had started to happen. And so most universities were paying a lot more attention around how do we actually get students to feel at home and help them feel more comfortable in a new environment in a way that is just bluntly less dangerous. Because
Right.
I think there were a lot of problems previously.
So you were obviously involved in a lot of extracurricular activities. And I read, I guess, that around this point in your career, you started to think about wanting your life to have an impact. Where did that desire come from?
That's a fun question. I'm not certain, to be honest. I don't know that I could point back at any specific thing that drove it. I think the way my parents raised me, there was always an element of service, right? You always wanted to be thinking about how can you do more for others. So that was certainly part of it, being raised that way. And not particularly church going today, but grew up around church communities, and it was the same thing. Like, you were part of a community, and so there was always that element to it. And I think, I think growing up in Sarnia, seeing the impact that that science can have on the world was also pretty motivating to me. But it's not like I can point back at like a formative event where I can say there is where I decided I wanted to make a difference in the world. It kind of always been there, I think.
Okay, just a slow progression. So, in your undergraduate courses, were there any particular professors or any courses in particular that kind of got you interested in life sciences?
Yeah, so it's funny. I actually came into university and was originally planning on studying zoology, and then ended up having first year chemistry, first year physics, first year biology, and my first year chemistry professors were absolutely incredible. And I actually had one of those professors every year because he taught several of the more advanced classes in the chemical physics stream. But again, it was all about impact, right? It wasn't just like memorize these chemical reactions. It was about this is why this matters. This is why this matters in your daily life. And I've always found the best teachers I've ever had have been able to tie back the science to why. And I also think honestly that makes it a heck of a lot easier to learn. So that program was so fantastic. I said, you know what, I want to study chemistry. And so I started in chemistry and then focused on chemical physics because there's different kinds of chemistry. There's organic chemistry and inorganic chemistry and chemical physics. And my perspective has always been that the stuff that comes naturally to you is the stuff that is you should really be focusing on. And I found the physics part, like the kind of intuitive understanding of forces, was something I understood a lot better than organic chemistry, which I tended to find was like a lot of memorization, which is funny because, if you talk to people that loved organic chemistry, they would say organic chemistry came naturally to them, but the physical chemistry felt like a lot of memorization. So it goes back to my point that it's whatever comes naturally to you is where you should spend your time.
Yeah, good point. Reading between the lines here, do you think maybe you got into biology and agriculture through the back door of chemistry? Is that a fair comment?
No, 100%. I grew up around farming, but had never thought about being involved in agriculture.
So you graduated from the University of Toronto with your Bachelor of Sciences degree in 2001, which was around the time the telecom industry in Ontario was collapsing. Did you have any job offers at that point?
It's a funny question. So yes, I would say first 2 years of my undergraduate degree, I'd always thought I want to do my PhD, potentially go into academia, potentially be a professor. And then I burned out incredibly badly in years 3 and 4. I took on too much. I had too many different activities and just ended up saying, I'm not going to be able to do this. I'm not going to be able to go to graduate school. And so finished up with my bachelor's and thought it was going to be absolutely perfect timing because this was 2001. I had a degree in chemical physics. Folks with chemical physics degrees were getting hired by Nortel and JDS and these giant telecom companies that were leading Canada, anchor firms in Canada. And I was so excited, applied for all these jobs. And I think I had 3 job offers that I had given that were then retracted because the telecom space was just collapsing in Canada. And so it was quite frustrating. And I remember I'd been looking for a job for probably about 4 or 5 months at this point, and ended up going in and talking to the undergraduate chair of the Department of Chemistry. And I said to her, having trouble finding a job, just curious if you have any advice for me. And she said, well, a master's degree only takes you a year to do. And I said, yeah, I don't know. Like I was pretty burnt out. I didn't really want to go back to school. She said, it's only a year. You can keep an eye out for the right gig. I'd encourage you to think about it. But I went away and thought about it and eventually ended up deciding that it was in fact worth applying for a master's degree. And it turned out to have been a pretty good decision.
Well, now between ending your undergrad and starting your master's, you started up a tutoring company?
Yeah, so I actually did that while I was in undergrad. I had started tutoring and I'd gotten to the point where I was probably tutoring, 15 or 20 hours a week when I was in undergrad.
That's a lot of time.
It was, but there's a huge demand for folks that can really explain physical chemistry, some of the math concepts, things like that. I think that you don't typically have folks that are as good at teaching in those scenarios. And I found I was pretty good at it and had a lot of demand for my services. And, given what I was getting paid and, I was paying my own way through school, it was a really efficient way to graduate without a ton of student debt. And so when I applied for my master's, it isn't like you apply apply, then you just get in and start the next day. There ended up being about a 9 to 12 month period where I was waiting to find out if I was going to get in and until I could start and that type of thing. I expanded my tutoring business pretty dramatically during that period. And I'd gotten to the point where I was working 30, 35 hours a week, which was a lot, and making pretty good money at it. I actually got to the point where I started thinking about hiring other people to tutor for me. Ultimately ended up concluding that I felt like I could build a pretty good business that way, but also that then I would be trapped running a tutoring business for the rest of my career, and that wasn't really what I wanted to do. So ended up shutting it down and doing my master's. But it was pretty successful.
Now, the university professor who suggested you pursue your master's was Dr. Cynthia Goh, wasn't it?
Correct. Yeah, and she's who I ended up doing my master's and then my PhD with.
Hi, it's Jim. When we come back, Darren talks about the advice he received from a mentor that made him reconsider his goals and how that decision set him on the path to founding his company. Stay with us. I'm Jim Wilson, and you're listening to NGBideas. Hi, Jim here. We'd like to take a moment to ask a quick favor. The goal of this show and our other podcasts is to promote Canada's life sciences community, and we hope you like what we're doing. If you do, please tell your friends about us. We will greatly appreciate you promoting us on social with the hashtags NGBI, NGBideas, and NGBI Summit. We really appreciate your support, and thank you so much for listening. Let's get back to our conversation. Hi, it's Jim Wilson. This is NGBideas, and my guest today is Darren Anderson from Vive Crop Protection in Mississauga, Ontario. I've heard of her, and what I've read about her strikes me like she's a powerhouse, and I'd appreciate you telling us about her.
Yeah, powerhouse and incredibly visionary. And she had previously started a company called Excella Biosciences that had a unique new way of measuring things in blood. Remember the Theranos story, right? Where they were developing like a blood test where it could tell if you had all these diseases and stuff, except it was all snake oil and it was a giant fraud. Excella was like that, except that the technology actually worked. And it was significantly before Theranos was founded. So they were doing some really, really interesting stuff. They were building equipment for researchers and that kind of thing. But I got a chance to do my master's on a project that was related to what Excella was doing, which was super interesting and got me my first exposure to an entrepreneurial business, albeit as like somebody who's super young. And I certainly didn't appreciate all the subtleties when I was working on that. And that's something that Cynthia's always been just incredibly good at. Like her students come out incredibly well-rounded because she makes sure that they get a really, really good scientific education, because you can't learn that later, right? You gotta develop that while you're in school. She makes sure that you get exposed to all of the other different elements of becoming a well-rounded contributor in whatever kind of job. I think sometimes in academia, there's this perspective that when you are doing your PhD, the only thing you're studying for is to be a professor someday. But I think it's only like 20% of science students actually end up doing that. The other 80% end up going and, doing jobs in all sorts of interesting areas. And that was a big part of how Cynthia trained us, was to give us the opportunity to get exposed. So when I was in grad school, I got a chance to do my thesis on the project with Excella. I got a chance to write major grant applications. I got a chance to we had a conference that we organized in Toronto every year called the Chemical Biophysics Symposium, where we had some of the best scientists in the world come to this student-led conference, because it turns out when students ask the best scientists in the world to come, often they're willing to do so. I got a chance to do all of this incredible stuff because that was how she approached training your students. And I think more and more of that happens now, but back then that was way ahead of the time, as was all the entrepreneurial training, which was also incredibly important and is honestly the only reason the company we founded exists today.
Okay. So, and the following year you started your PhD, but shortly after you got into the program, you had a bit of a realization about your career path that you briefly touched on, which was I don't want to do this.
That's right. I did not want to be a professor. I enjoy science. I enjoyed the research, but that wasn't the path that I wanted to go down. And in my view, you have to love the science, and it needs to be something that you want to spend all of your time thinking about. And that just wasn't me. And I realized that about a year into my PhD, so 2 years into grad school. And even there, the reason I stuck around for my PhD was my master's. I was like, I enjoy this. This is fun. And then I got a year into my PhD and thought, this is fun, but I'm not sure I want to do it long term.
Okay. And I want to unpack, I guess, the next step, which is talking about where the idea for the company came from. Was there kind of a eureka moment in the lab when kind of a proof of concept became a reality, or was it a progression?
Yeah, so let me make a statement first to begin with. I didn't have anything to do with the technology that it now underlies our company today.
Okay.
That was actually primarily developed by one of our co-founders, Dr. Jordan Dingleson, who's still our VP of Research today. Although it was in collaboration with some of the other scientists that ended up being co-founders of the company, including Cynthia and a couple of postdoctoral fellows in the lab. But it was an interesting project. Jordan and our colleagues had discovered that there was a really efficient way to make and deliver materials that were important for a variety of applications. But it wasn't necessarily clear that there was a business idea there. It was very much a science project. We continued to work on it. But I mentioned earlier that Cynthia was a visionary. So one of the things that she did when we were in grad school is she organized a set of programming that at the time was called Entrepreneurship 101. And the idea was that she would bring in speakers that all had advanced scientific degrees, PhDs in chemistry, physics, biology, but that were doing different elements that would be required to start a business. So you'd have somebody come in that would be involved in people and culture or recruitment or marketing or intellectual property or sales, or had been a serial entrepreneur, all these different folks. Whether we started companies or not, it was one of the coolest things and something I really, really wish more folks in science got exposed to. Because when you're studying engineering, there's this working assumption that, great, I'll have an engineering degree, but I don't have to go be an engineer. There's lots of stuff I could do with an engineering degree.
Good
and
point.
If you're studying English, it's not like the only thing you think you're going to be able to do is be a writer. But if you study chemistry, you assume the only thing you can do is be a chemist. And that's just nonsense. A good academic training helps you learn. It helps you develop skills and a critical way of looking at the world. And so this entrepreneurship course was awesome because we got exposed to all these cool things you could do with an advanced degree, most of which you would think, like, how does somebody who runs a recruiting company or is in marketing, how do you get there from a PhD? And we got to hear those stories. So that was incredibly cool. And then the entrepreneurial part on top of it is that at the end of the course, the organizer of the course, who I will remind you was my PhD supervisor and therefore my boss, encouraged everyone in the course to give a talk on something that had been developed in their lab and give a pitch on it. And of course, when your boss encourages you to do something like that, yes, happy to do so. And so we put together a pitch, right? An initial, like, this is how we would think about building a business with this technology. And that had two effects. So I ended up kind of leading the team that put together that pitch and then delivering the pitch. And then giving the pitch, all I could think when I walked off was, I love doing this. I love talking about building something and envisioning building something. And now I want to build something. And so that was the moment where I said, let's do this.
2005, and in October 2006, the company that we're kind of talking about spun out of the Department of Chemistry at the University of Toronto. And I'm guessing you spent the better part of that interregnum between 05 and 06 working on the business plan?
This is a lesson that I learned that I now pass along to folks that are a little bit earlier in the journey. We sat down, myself, Jordan, Cynthia, the other co-founders, and we really laid out a roadmap for what we thought we needed to prove about our technology before we would go out and actually start the business. And I think we had like 4 years of experiments we were planning on doing. And it was a very academic way of thinking about it, because it was very much about making everything perfect, but not about getting it out into the real world to see if it had a real fit. So we had started that, and we had some support for some of that early technology and getting the first patents filed and things like that. And I remember, I think this was about a year into this work, I was doing what became Vive Crop Protection part-time. and I was working part-time at the university, doing some academic programming. And I remember a mentor of mine said to me, Darren, you have two jobs right now, and it's very clear which one of the two jobs you're enjoying more. So let's figure out how to get you to be able to do that all the time. And we ended up pitching what was Ontario Centers of Excellence. I believe it's now OCI.
OCI, yeah.
For the concept that we developed, and we were like, and we think we've got like another 2 years of testing. And the program manager at the time said, what are you talking about? This is good enough. Let's go. And so we pitched them. They made the first investment into the company. I still have a picture of us holding a giant novelty $250,000 check. And we spun the company out, like you said, in fall 2006 was really when we got started, although technically we were incorporated March 3rd, 2006.
Now, the company was called Northern Nanotechnologies at that point, correct?
Yeah, that's the kind of name that you get when you allow a bunch of scientists to name a company, yes.
And how long before you said, yeah, let's not do this, let's call it Vive? And who came up with the name?
I never said that, to be clear. I love Northern Nanotechnologies. I was very wrong. It was a terrible name. I will acknowledge that now. But I had thought that it was a good name. So we'd been going for a few years and had looked at a variety of different applications. It was really interesting. Like, we got started making materials for medical devices and displays. So if you actually look at QLED TVs, people will sometimes see marketed, that basically uses the same kind of technology that we were developing. And our core advantage was that we could make these materials very inexpensively and at massive scale. But it turns out no one cares about cost or scale when they're putting a tiny amount, like milligrams of material, into a television or a medical device. And so we spent some time looking at where the applications where you actually care about delivery of material at scale and cost effectively, and ended up deciding agriculture was an opportunity. At the same time, some of the other folks that were on the executive team, including our founding CEO that we brought in about 6 months into the company's life, Keith Thomas, sat down and said, look, this Northern Nanotechnologies thing, it's not really working for us. And so we went through this whole exercise of renaming the company, which, again, I was the technical guy, very upset that we were spending all of this time on branding. Again, was wrong. And we ended up coming up with Vive Nano was what it was at the time, because the technology is based on nanotechnology, and that's since evolved into Vive Crop Protection. It's been an awesome brand and an awesome company name, and all of the folks that said that we needed to change it were correct.
So you changed the company name, and do you remember what that time of your life was like?
I look back so the company's 18 years old today, and I look back over that 18 years, and I look back at the number of times I said to myself, as soon as we get to milestone X, it will get easier. And the actual answer is that as soon as you get to milestone X, it gets harder and more complicated in a good way, right? Because you're having real impact and you have to worry about more things, more ambitious. The ambition, we actually had that conversation a couple of weeks ago at a recent board meeting where I talked about how much our ambition at Vive has actually changed even over the last 12 months. I think all good entrepreneurs have to have that kind of growth mindset and the excitement about learning, or else you're just not going to be successful. I mean, when we started, going back to that course that I took, that entrepreneurship course, one of the cool things was I got to meet all of these awesome people that had done it before. And I think in our first year, I probably had breakfast 3 days a week with somebody from that course, just where I would be like, hey, pick your brain on this, or we need a lawyer for this, or, here's how we're thinking about insurance. And the generosity of all of those folks and willingness to pay it forward was just so cool. And it's one of the reasons I do things like this, because I consider myself to have built up a bit of a debt during that period, and I want to make sure that I pay it back.
So the initial capital for the company was a government fund from OCI. Did you have other investors from day one, or was the company bootstrapped?
We had other investors from day one. So I mentioned earlier recruiting in our founding CEO. So he had recently sold his last business. This is Keith Thomas. He had sold his last business, and so he invested, as did some of the other investors from his previous business. So it was that was really the seed capital that got us started. And to remind everybody, I mean, it's really interesting today because there's so much out there about entrepreneurship and like how do you do a seed round, and there's all of this like structure around safes and ways to do it inexpensively and kind of very standardized ways of doing things. None of that existed back in 2006. Certainly none of it existed in Canada. And so we were super fortunate to be able to bring on Keith because he'd done it before. He had that kind of experience. But we were creating it all from scratch.
Well, is asking for money a humbling experience?
Yes. I mean, we're in a capital raise right now, and the general rule of thumb is you're going to get, somewhere between, I don't know, 10 and 99 doors slammed in your face before somebody says yes. And some of that's fit, right? Like it isn't necessarily that you've got a bad business idea or that you're not going to be successful. Some of it's just you go to chat with folks and just with what they're looking for, it's not a fit, or the timelines that you're operating in versus the timelines that they want an exit. But you get a lot of no's. I really enjoy raising capital because I really enjoy telling our story, and I enjoy debating issues and having that kind of thought partnership with folks that are going to be partners, right? I mean, our earliest investors have been partners in our business for 18 years. That's literally the same amount of time that I've been with my wife. Those partnerships are important, and that relationship's important. And so, I think it's good that you end up spending that kind of time making sure that you get the right folks to work with.
Yeah, well, you mentioned your wife. I understand you met her in a bar called Einstein's playing pool.
That is correct. Somewhat hilariously, I found out that one of the other folks on my team at Vive had the exact same experience meeting their partner, which was very funny, including the friends that were there that were like, "Are you sure?" So it's very funny. It was a very small world. But yes, met her at a bar playing pool.
Sorry, what's her name?
Emmanuel.
And Emmanuel, so she was playing pool, and you were there with friends and drifted together, and that was what, 2006?
Yep, about that.
Okay, and you're married. You got married in 2012, right?
Correct. A dog and cat, no kids. Lots of kids in our lives, but not for the two of us.
Gotcha. When you started your career at Vive, you were the chief technology officer. Was that the job you wanted?
Yeah, 100%. I still viewed myself at the time as the technical guy, and I wasn't the smartest scientist or the one that was making sure that everything that we had worked. I mean, that was Jordan, and we've hired a ton of incredibly talented folks, including folks that have been with the company since year one. We actually have someone retiring here at the end of the year who spent almost 18 years with us, which is really, really cool. So incredibly bright folks. I viewed my role as a translator. Right. So my role was to take the incredible science that was being done and work with partners or investors to explain how that technology works and how it would have an impact. So really, really enjoyed that. And even though, as I mentioned earlier, when I was doing my PhD, I decided I didn't want to go be an academic. I've always loved the science and the impact of the science. I just didn't want to just do the science.
Right.
There's a group of other CTOs I used to talk to, and we all used to laugh because chief technology officer can mean like 40 different things at 40 different companies. And so we just made it our own.
Was the transition from university bench research to helping run a company a difficult transition for you?
I would suspect, just from conversations I've had with other entrepreneurs, I mean, there's always a level of imposter syndrome when you're starting
Right.
something, right? And one of the things I like to say to graduate students today that are thinking of starting a company is, starting a company out of something like a PhD or a grad degree or an undergrad degree, that's a really cool time to start something new because you have the unique combination of arrogance and humility of that stage in your life, right? You have the arrogance of being young and you're going to change the world, and nobody else has ever done this thing, but you're going to be able to do it, which is a belief you have to have in order to be a successful entrepreneur. But you also have the humility of you've been spending your entire career learning, right? And so you're not going to be able to get there on your own. You have to bring in smart people to help you. You have to meet folks and ask questions and learn and develop new skills. And so I think that's a reason why you do tend to see a lot of companies that get started by folks that are early career be quite successful. But I would be willing to bet a pretty large sum of money that if you talk to Zuckerberg or Bill Gates or anybody like that and you ask them, like, when your company first crossed being worth $1 billion, did you still have an inferiority complex? And did you still feel like, you had imposter syndrome? And I would bet they would both say yes.
That's a good observation. So you were the CTO for just over 9 years until October 2015, when you became the chief communications officer and vice president regulatory, which to me sounds like the role was focused on government relations. Is that accurate?
On the regulatory side, yes. The communications officer was more of a marketing facing role. And so we were just at the point where we were starting to start selling some of our products. And so it was really a pivot onto supporting the commercial side of the organization, although it was a few years before we really started selling effectively. But bluntly, what actually was happening during that period is I had put myself out of a job. I had gotten to the point where I realized because we had gone from a generalist company that was doing stuff in personal care and catalysis and water treatment and medical devices and all this stuff to an ag company, I realized we needed to bring some folks on that had agriculture expertise. And so effectively, I advocated for hiring a new head of product development that came from the ag industry, hired that person in, brought them in, and then kind of said, all right, well, I guess I'll go do this for a while and we'll see if there's a fit here for me. But it was clearly what was right for the business at the time. And it absolutely was. And it was transformational. We did the same thing on the commercial side at the same time. We brought on a lead on the commercial side and took one of the other kind of founding executives and had him do other things as well for the same reason. He just didn't have the connectivity in agriculture. And so it was a transition period for the business.
So about a year and a half later, in May 2017, you were appointed president. And in June 2019, you were appointed CEO, which is the position you now hold. Was this kind of a predestined or predetermined path that you consciously were pursuing, or was it just circumstantial?
Yeah, no, by the time we got to the president transition, that was really pretty intentional between my predecessor and again, our founding CEO and I. You know, he'd been running the business at that point for about 10 years. He's not an ag guy, and I love the industry and I want to spend my whole career here. And I think it's amazing how much of an impact technology and innovation is having in agriculture. And so he and I had just agreed that it was an appropriate transition plan. Like when exactly we were going to do it, we were trying to stay flexible because you do have to be thoughtful about it in terms of how the market's going to view it and investors and making sure everyone's comfortable. But it had been planned over that period, and he's still on the board and still an important part of the business. So I'm certainly grateful for what he did to lead the business over that time, and have been excited to pick up the baton and push the business forward.
Hi, it's Jim. When we come back, Darren talks about leadership, what the role of a CEO requires, and why building a successful company takes more than just a good plan. Stay with us. I'm Jim Wilson, and you're listening to NGBideas. I mentioned earlier that we produce this podcast and our other shows to help promote Next Great Big Ideas, Canada's Life Sciences Summit. But that's not the whole story. NGBI is also an independently organized, not-for-profit fundraising event in support of McMaster Children's Hospital in Hamilton, Ontario. Mac Kids is one of the top critical care pediatric hospitals in Canada that serves families and patients in need from Niagara Falls through Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, and north to Owen Sound in Grey County. If you're interested in supporting a great cause, we hope you will consider supporting Mac Kids. For more information, please go to hamiltonhealthsciences.ca/McMaster-Children's-Hospital. Now you know our why. Let's get back to the show. Hi, it's Jim Wilson, and my guest today is Darren Anderson, who is the founder and CEO of Vive Crop Protection. The American venture capitalist Fred Wilson, who, as far as I know, is no relation to me, believes the CEO has three jobs. Make sure the ship is pointed in the right direction, make sure you have the right people on the team, and make sure you got money in the bank. Would you agree with that?
That's completely correct. My favorite author that's written about entrepreneurship is an author by the name of Eric Severinghaus, and he wrote a book called Scaling Your Everest. And so he's a mountain climber and a marathoner that's also an entrepreneur. For any potential entrepreneurs or existing entrepreneurs, like I said, highly, highly recommended. But his reframing of that statement, I also really like, which is, in order to build a successful company, you really only have to do three things: keep moving forward, don't give up, and don't die. And that's true whether you're climbing a mountain, running a marathon, or building a business. Now, for the building a business, I actually add a fourth one to that, which is you have to catch a tailwind. I think if you look at the most successful businesses, they've done those first three things, right? They've continued to build out the team and the product and keep moving the business forward. They haven't given up. They've kept enough cash in the bank to survive the inevitable downturns. But usually something has happened that's like an external factor, or they got lucky, or they signed a huge deal, or they brought in an amazing person, or something that was catalytic that then just shot them off to the stratosphere. And I think that that's an important element of building a successful business as well.
That's a really good point. Like timing, as they say, it's everything. And we have had some guests on this show who have said that they did everything right and they still failed. And because either the solution was before its time, or there were external factors that just prevented them from moving forward. So yeah, that's interesting.
I'm a huge believer that entrepreneurs need to acknowledge the role of luck in their successes. If you think about it, I mean, our business has been around for 18 years. I think we've been down to, call it, under 3 months of cash, maybe a dozen times, something like that. If you think about our job in management, our job is to have, plan A for how you're going to manage through plan B, plan C, et cetera. Effectively, you're trying to load the dice, right? You're trying to make sure that when you're rolling the dice, you're not going to roll snake eyes. But even if you've got a 95% chance of getting through each one of those potential failure points, that's a 5% chance the first time, and 5% chance the second time, and a 5% chance the third time. By the time you've done that 12 times, you're much more likely to have gone under than not, even if you had a 95% chance of getting through each of those potential failure points. And 95% means you've done an amazing job of managing the risk profile of the business. So I think successful entrepreneurs should show some humility. Not that what they've done isn't important, and not that there isn't a huge amount of making smart decisions and working hard and hiring the right people and building a team. Like, all of that's critical, but luck ends up playing into it as well. I think the lack of acknowledgement of that, and when folks talk about their businesses and they say everything was up and to the right the whole time, I mean, there's a survivorship bias, right? The people that are telling the stories because they're billion-dollar businesses are the ones that got there, that got lucky, that didn't roll snake eyes any of those 12 times. And I think it's a shame. And I actually think it's damaging from an entrepreneurial kind of mental health perspective, because, as an entrepreneur that's struggling, that's going through one of those gaps, you're comparing yourself to all these folks that have made it where everything's amazing. And I guarantee it's not. I guarantee that there's a ton of problems that are going on there, and that they may not make it, but you always are comparing yourself out to the market. So I'll get off my soapbox, but it's something I'm really passionate about.
Well, and you know what? That's a great point, and I appreciate you sharing it, because a big goal of this podcast is to just provide lessons to the people who are following or thinking of following in your footsteps and the footsteps of other guests. What do you like most about being a CEO?
I have two answers to that question. The first is the impact. So we do a weekly all hands, get the whole company together. And one of the things I love every week is our commercial organization talks about our customers using our products and the benefits that it's having for them. Whether that's helping them be more productive, increasing the yields of the crops that they're harvesting, making their lives easier so that they can spend time at their kids' baseball games, improving the sustainability of their operation. Like, hearing those stories is just so exciting. And, if you look at Vive's corporate values, the one that I always end up talking about is we're passionate about building something real. And it's that building something that's having that real world impact. And when we were talking earlier in the conversation, right? My Emmanuel jokes that I have a beauty pageant speech that I always used to give on this topic. But that's number one. That's the thing I love the most. The other element, though, is every day is different, and I've always loved learning. I've always loved being a mile wide and an inch deep. And I continue to be able to do different stuff every day now. And I mentioned earlier, I always was like, well, once we get here, it's going to be easier. Once we get here, it's going to be easier. And the answer is, once you get here, everything becomes more complicated. But that's been fun. I've loved learning new skills and being able to do new things at each stage in the company's evolution.
Somebody told me once that running a business is not a marathon. It's an endless series of sprints, and the rest for a bit and you do it all over again. You mentioned your team earlier. Could you tell us about your team?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I'll just say our team's amazing. They make it so much fun to come into work every day. They're a huge part of why I do what I do. We're just under 70 people now, so we're getting to a pretty significant scale. About 30 of those are scientists and engineers that are based in our Toronto office that are really responsible for driving the engine of innovation and the new products that we're launching onto the market that are having that impact, making growers' lives easier, helping them be more productive. And so that's an amazing team. Our commercial organization is in the US. It's about 20 folks. And then we've got some operational support, manufacturing, regulatory, et cetera, which can be either here or in the US. And we've got, as I mentioned earlier, the original founding scientist who developed the technology is still with us. Our head of regulatory has been with us 16 years now, I think. Didn't start in regulatory, started as a manufacturing technician, but now is leading regulatory for us globally. Some of the scientists have been with us for a long time as well. It's a really, really cool team. I often talk about like building an R&D company, an R&D engine in Canada, regardless of where you're commercializing. And again, a commercial organization's all in the US. It's just such an incredible place to build one because the talent's incredible. The universities are incredible. There is a lot of government support, which makes a huge difference to your ability to take risk from an R&D perspective. It's an amazing place, and the team's incredible.
What's been your biggest win so far?
I would say the single coolest day that I've had in the company's life would have been in 2016. And I flew down and drove out to Oakland, Illinois, when I got to see the first farmer apply one of our products to his corn crop. And that was in April, something like that, 2016. I've still got the picture on my phone as one of my backdrops. And then I went back in the fall and got to see the benefits that farmer had in terms of healthier corn. And they'd had a bunch of wind. And so the corn that hadn't had our product on it was all fallen over and super hard to harvest. And our product had worked really, really well. It still gives me goosebumps. Just that was incredibly cool.
Now, here we are talking about your company. We haven't actually explained to our listeners what it is you do. So the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah. So growers that are using inputs, whether they're fertilizers or a biostimulant that might help a crop grow more effectively, or a synthetic or a bio-based pesticide, the performance of those inputs is really driven by how they interact with the environment. So how do they stick better to a leaf, or how do they move in the soil, or how do they mix with other products in the spray tank? And it turns out that understanding and controlling that interaction between the input and its environment is all based on nanotechnology, which is just the science of things that are really, really small, interactions that are 1/10,000th the size of a human hair. And just to give you an idea, that's about 1/10 millionth the size of you or I, and we're about 1/10 millionth the size of the Earth. So this is like really, really small. But if you can understand and control that interaction of a crop input at that scale, you can help it be used in new ways. You can help it be more effective. You can help a farmer do more with less. And so that's really what our business is about. It's about understanding, and then we have a proprietary technology that helps us control that interaction at the nanoscale to optimize the performance of crop inputs, typically pesticides, whether they're synthetic or bio-based, and help the grower be more productive, but also improve their ability to do more with less and be more sustainable by optimizing the application of these materials.
Thank you for that. Even I understood that, so I appreciate it. Let me reverse that question. What's been your biggest loss, and what did you take away from that experience?
So there was a period 7 or 8 years ago, and the company was in a lot of trouble. It was a really challenging environment. We were running out of capital. We were putting our own cash into the company just to make payroll. And to be candid, I didn't think the company was going to survive. I thought it was one of these times where we'd loaded the dice. We'd only gotten it to 80%, and I was pretty sure we were gonna roll snake eyes. And I was miserable. I viewed I'm going to be a failure. This is awful. All these folks are relying on us. Ended up, Emmanuel and I were on vacation in New York. Remember her saying to me, she said, "Darren, you need to tie less of your ego up in the success of the company." And I said to her, I don't do that. Like, that's not the problem here. We kind of talked about it, but I kind of dismissed it. And then a couple of days later, we were back in Toronto, and I was talking to one of my best friends. And I said, this is a conversation I was having with Emmanuel, and I just don't get it. And he said, "You should listen to her. She's right." Said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. This doesn't apply to me. It's not an ego thing. It's not, and I don't mean it in like the like being really proud of it, but I meant like tying up a sense of like your personal self worth is driven by what happens at the company.
And your
And so I
identity too.
said, your identity too. So I said that's not me. So I ended up going. I was working with an executive coach at the time, and I met with that executive coach, and as I'm working with the same coach today, and I said to her, "Can you imagine this thing that Emmanuel and one of my best friends said?" She said, "So you've gotten this advice from your wife and your best friend, one of your best friends, who know you better than anyone else in the world, and you've decided to ignore it?"
Coach.
And I said, "Well, not now that you've put it like that." Honestly, it took a while for that. I had to get that pounded into me, but it was the single most transformative insight I've probably ever had in my life, because I've always tied up that ego, that self-worth with what I do, because I've been so passionate about it, right? I want to have an impact. I want to change the world. Like, that's always been a big part of going back to the comment I made about luck earlier. I can't control everything. I can't guarantee that the company is going to be successful. And another colleague of mine that used to say, all you can do is all you can do. All I can do is work hard, make good decisions, try to build the right culture, lead with ethics. Like, that's all I can do. I can't control the outcome. And so realizing that during that really challenging period, and around the same time, I remember talking to my parents, and they said, if you're having all these troubles, like, why don't you just go to your shareholders and say, this is where we're at? Are folks willing to step up and help? And we ended up doing that. We reset the company, and now we're going to be in an amazing place. And there's an amazing opportunity to be able to build an anchor firm here in Canada because of some of that advice we got back then.
Wow, what a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Has there ever been a time, and maybe we've already touched on it, where professionally or personally, where you were just in front of a wall and you were not sure that you were going to get around it? Is that what we're talking about, or what we've been talking about?
Yeah. I mean, that was 100%. I didn't think we were going to get through that period. I didn't think we were going to get through it, because I didn't think we were going to be able to bring in, I mean, again, what's the CEO's job, right? Keep the shifts pointing in the right direction, get the right people on board, and make sure you don't run out of cash. I was convinced we were going to run out of cash. And it was funny, because one of the things that I realized during that period, this is after I'd had some of these realizations about not tying up your ego. And so your listeners may decide that I didn't take the lesson as well out of the gate. But I was thinking a little bit of like, if it goes under, what would I want to do next? And then basically my conclusion was, I would try to go access the intellectual property and do it again, because I really believed in what we're trying to accomplish at Vive and the difference that we're looking to make in the world. And so I would have taken another run at it, but I didn't think we were going to survive that period. And it is somewhat funny, because we've certainly, every time we've gone out to raise capital, when we've gone out to raise larger rounds, my predecessor and I always used to joke that as soon as we go out to raise capital, there'd be like a major market change and everything would become more challenging, let's say. So you do have to have that kind of grit and willingness to kind of roll with the punches as you scale.
There's a general lack of awareness, both in the community, but generally in the public. It's preventing perhaps the sector from getting to the next level faster. It's like it's hidden behind a curtain right in front of our eyes.
Yeah, there's two elements to that I think are interesting. I mean, the first is, one of the reasons I love agriculture, and it's been such a fascinating industry to be a part of, is because there's so much innovation that happens that a typical like urban consumer just may not be familiar with, right? I mean, self-driving tractors first showed up like 25 or 30 years ago. Folks are using drones to apply application. There's laser weeders that go out and shoot lasers at weeds to kill them. There's all the vertical farming innovation. There's variable rate applications, so that you're applying the right number of seeds based on the soil conditions that you're measuring when you're planting. And that's just on the crop side. And then you think about like what happens in dairies or some of the new protein. There's so much innovation, and there's such an opportunity for technology to be a force for good in agriculture and help us put amazing food on the table for all of us and all of our families, while also lessening some of the impact of agriculture on the environment. So it is such a cool industry, and there's so much innovation. But I do think the general public's just not aware of it. In my view, it's a sector that in Canada we should dominate. In most industries, if you think about like a typical tech company, or you're a pharma company, or you're, developing a consumer good or something like that, the Canadian market's a tenth the size of the US market and is a tiny part of the global economy. So you may be building a company here in Canada, but there's no reason to focus on Canada. There's no reason for you to consider it your home market. You're usually better off to go to the US quickly, and you may maintain your headquarters here, but it won't be a critical strategic part of your growth strategy. And in agriculture is a third of the US. We punch above our weight in agriculture more than anything else in the world because we are such a big country from a physical land that is arable, that is capable of producing food. And so it is an industry that, in my view, we absolutely should be owning. And unfortunately, just historically, the way that ag's been exploited in Canada tends to be much more of we'll produce the commodities, but then we send them somewhere else to be processed, or we'll import technology from elsewhere. The big chemical companies are all now headquartered in China, in Germany, in the US. We really don't have any of that domestic capacity here anymore. So a big part of what I'm proud about what we're building here in Vive is we're really aiming to build that anchor firm here in Canada, and we'll service global markets. And today the US is our biggest commercial footprint, but we'll do it from a domestic position of strength where that Canadian market is a huge part of our success, and one that we can be incredibly proud to build over time.
I read that you think one of the key ingredients to being a good leader is to have self-awareness.
That is correct. I do believe that. In order for you to be an effective leader, I mentioned earlier, I believe successful entrepreneurs need to have a growth mindset. You need to always be learning. You always need to be developing new skills. But a precondition to having an effective growth mindset is to be self-aware, to know what you're good at, know what you're bad at, know where you need to complement your skills with other folks on the team that are going to be significantly better in different ways. To know that you've had a long week at the office and you're about to go into a one-on-one with a team member where they're going to share some bad news with you, and to be able to respond to that news instead of reacting to that news. And so that self-awareness helps you manage yourself, helps you be an effective leader, and helps you be intentional in terms of your leadership style when you're interacting with your team or when you're externally facing. But it also helps you get better over time because you know where your strengths and weaknesses are. And that doesn't always mean that you're going to focus on your weaknesses and trying to improve those. I remember the executive coach I mentioned earlier, who I still work with, I remember the first time I did a 360 with her, and we sat down to go through the results. And she gives me the little brochure, 10 pages or so in it. And the first 6 pages are strengths, the back 4 are weaknesses. So I start skipping past the first 6 pages to go right to the weaknesses at the back. She said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "Well, I want to understand where I need to develop." And she said, "It is much more important that you understand your strengths and what you're good at and make sure that you can capitalize on those. You should be spending twice as much time on your strengths as you do on your weaknesses." And again, that was incredibly, incredibly wise and bang on. I mean, when we hire, we should always be hiring for strength, not for lack of weakness. If you hire for lack of weakness, you end up getting a bunch of folks that are average, that don't want to take risks. If you hire for strengths, it may mean that there's gaps, but you can get a heck of a lot farther.
That is such great advice. And it's probably a good segue into my next question. The role of a company is obviously to make money, but one of the things I really love about this podcast is I get to speak with people like you who are driven as much by purpose as they are by profit. And we've never met, at least not to my knowledge. In the reading I did about you and the people I spoke with about you, you're one of those people who have made a difference throughout your career. And you were helping at the University of Toronto build the community and did a huge amount of volunteer work. And you and your team at Vive Crop Protection are having a massive impact on food production around the world. And you're also involved in a number of other organizations. And first, you're a director of Crop Life America. And I'd appreciate you taking a moment to tell us about that organization.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I've always viewed that for anybody who's living in Canada today, we're some of the luckiest people that have ever existed in the world. And so my view has always been, because I am one of the luckiest people that has ever existed, I owe it to future generations to really try to make the world a better place. And that's always driven me. And so, as you noted, I'm on the board of Crop Life America. I'm also on the board of Crop Life Canada. And in both cases, what I'm excited about with both of those organizations is that they're advocating for the use of technology technology to make our food production more effective and more efficient and help growers do more with less. You heard me talk earlier, Wex, poetically about the impact of technology in agriculture. I think it's just been a massive force for good, and it's one that's happened in the backgrounds, and a lot of consumers aren't aware of it, but it's so cool what's happening today. And whether that's, new pesticides that are much more specific and can be used at much lower rates, variable rate applications, protections that are being put in place to try to ensure that there's less environmental impact. Like, there's so much innovation and sustainability work being done by these organizations that just ends up being a bit in the background. And so I'm really excited to have been part of both CropLife America and more recently CropLife Canada, in addition to some of the other not-for-profit work that I do.
Hey, it's Jim. When we come back, Darren talks about the organizations he supports beyond Vive and why he believes technology has such an important role to play in the future of agriculture. Stay with us. I'm Jim Wilson, and you're listening to NGBideas. If you're a new listener, we'd like you to know this podcast is part of Next Great Big Ideas, Canada's Life Sciences Summit. NGBI is an independently organized, not-for-profit national networking event for the Canadian life sciences community, and we invite you to attend. Welcome back. It's Jim Wilson, and my guest today is Darren Anderson from Vive Crop Protection in Mississauga, Ontario. Now, what do those organizations, CropLife America and CropLife Canada, actually do?
Yeah, so they're the trade association that represents primarily the pesticide manufacturers, whether they're synthetic pesticides that growers have been using for years or next generation biologicals, so like bio-based products. So there's a lot of companies that are developing bacteria and things like that that can help help a crop be more effective or help deal with disease or that type of thing. And so the two trade associations represent that industry in Canada and the US respectively.
Now, you're also a member of the advisory committee of, is it Chloe, which is an organization to help increase STEM learning through agriculture and natural resources. Can you tell us a bit about that organization?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chloe's got a really, really cool approach to education. So most of us probably remember when we were kids, going on field trips, and teachers sometimes hated those field trips because you would lose a day of curriculum learning. Right. And so if you're going out to visit a farm, but you weren't actually learning anything, then the teachers would have to catch up more. Right. And there'd have to be more in classroom learning. And that often was challenging. And so what Chloe's really been trying to do is ensure that they can have true curriculum taught in real experiential outdoor learning environments. And they're primarily focused on particularly kids that might be from urban environments that don't get that kind of exposure. So getting them out to do an ecosystem project to understand what happens during rains in a river and what happens in learning how to do statistics around, how many minnows are forming in that river over time, or how does the mosquito population change. So it's all about curriculum-driven learning in outdoor environments to try to give, again, particularly urban students, the opportunity to get that exposure to external environments, agriculture and natural resources type environments, so that they understand that impact that's going to have on them over their lives and potentially consider it as an interesting career path. Really, really cool organization in the US. They haven't really come to Canada, but they've got a bunch of sites across the US and they've been really expanding. And I think that kind of innovation on the educational side is really, really interesting.
Now, perhaps in a similar vein, you're a founding member of an organization called ElectSTEM, which I think is a great initiative. What is that organization about?
It is similar. So ElectSTEM was an initiative that myself and a couple of co-founders started during the pandemic. What we're looking to do, if you look at our elected officials, it tends to be overrepresented by, business folks and lawyers and that type of thing. And I don't think you often see as many scientists or engineers considering running for elected office because they don't see themselves in our elected officials. And so our view was there's an opportunity to try to elect more scientists and engineers, since more and more of the issues we're going to be dealing with over the next 50 years have a science bent to them, and having more elected officials that have some exposure to that, we think would be a good thing. And so we set up ElectSTEM, which was a cross-partisan organization where what we wanted to do was provide scientists and engineers some exposure to other scientists and engineers that have run for public office and have been quite successful. We had a podcast, interviewed a bunch of folks that talked about their experiences. What is it like running for public office for the first time, federally, provincially, municipally? One thing I definitely learned is that most of them lost the first time, which, you got to have a growth mindset and learn, right? So some similar read across there. But really, really cool initiative, and something that we really enjoyed. We've wound down some of the programming just as our individual lives have gotten a little bit busier. And Vive's been very, very busy over the last little bit. But the podcast is still out there. It's called Periodically Political. Please don't judge too hard. That goes back to the Northern Nanotechnologies thing. This is a bunch of scientists naming a podcast instead of a bunch of scientists naming a company.
Well, it's like a real estate guy running a life sciences podcast. You're also a member of the board of the directors of Life Sciences Ontario and the 2021 winner of the LSO Company of the Year. And I was thinking that Vive is a really strong drug delivery company that just happens to be in agriculture. And I wonder if you think having an agri-tech company win that award surprised people.
I think it did. And it's actually been part of a really intentional move Life Sciences Ontario has been making to ensure that policymakers, when they're thinking about life sciences, are also thinking about agriculture. I mean, agriculture is about 8% of the Canadian economy. I talked earlier about how we should be punching above our weight. And the innovations and requirements for companies in agriculture are very, very similar to companies that are in new drug development or new medical device development. These products are all regulated. There's a lot of testing that needs to be required in order to make sure that the products are going to be effective and they're going to be able to be used safely. A lot of these companies, including ours, require a lot of life sciences infrastructure, wet labs and equipment and that type of thing. So how do you do that in an efficient way? There still are funding gaps in Canada and challenges around driving adoption in our domestic market. So how do you address that? Life Sciences Ontario has really been very intentional about trying to make sure that agriculture is part of the story and part of how we think about accelerating the growth of that sector here in Ontario. And I'm hugely a fan, and Life Sciences Ontario does incredible work. It was funny when we were awarded Life Sciences Ontario Company of the Year, I did a little interview, and one of the questions they asked me was, what advice would you give somebody who's early in their career today, say starting university? And I said, in my view, the last 20 years has been dominated by what we all describe as traditional tech, right? Facebook, Meta, engineering, computers, phones, et cetera. Like that's what's driven it. My view is the next 25 years is going to be dominated by life sciences. And you see that in terms of the amount of venture funding and innovation that's happening and things like what you're doing here. So it's been a really cool organization to be a part of. And I'm a huge advocate for their mission.
And likewise, great organization. If any of our listeners are just starting their professional careers, should they be calling you? Are you hiring right now?
We are, although I think we only have one position in Canada that we're currently hiring for, which is a marketing coordinator position. In the U.S., we have some commercial positions that are currently posted, some sales territories, and a product manager. But I mean, we've continued to grow. I think 3 years ago, we were at about 30 people. So certainly keep an eye out on our website. And if folks would like to come join the team, it's an incredible team. It's an incredible company culture. It's so much fun. And as I noted earlier, we're having a real world impact, which makes it a lot of fun to come into work every day. So, yeah, happy to have folks join our team.
Don, it takes a lot of confidence to get to where you are. Have you always been a confident person?
I did talk about imposter syndrome earlier, didn't I?
Yeah, but you can have imposter syndrome and still just be bullheaded and keep going.
Agreed. And you do, this goes back to you have to have that combination of humility and arrogance, right? You need to believe you're going to be able to accomplish something that nobody else has ever accomplished. I've always loved being the underdog. I think it's that grit and that ability to just keep pushing it forward. And if you talk to folks on my team, I think one of the things that they would say is I always try to make sure that I'm viewing the positives of whatever's happening and trying to keep a relatively positive view on things. That does get tiring. I think in the first year or so of COVID, talking to other entrepreneurs, like we are a source of energy for the rest of the organization, right? Because everybody is struggling in a variety of different ways. And that is a challenge, right? When the organization's struggling, part of the job of the CEO is to be that battery for the organization that folks can draw on.
Hmm.
But it's rewarding as well. So I've certainly always enjoyed it.
You mentioned the pandemic. It changed where and how we work. And for many, it also changed how we look at life. And I understand during the pandemic, you got into meditation and stoicism.
Well, and this actually ends up going back a little bit to what I was talking earlier about not tying up so much of your ego in the company. It's funny that I got this advice, and then during the pandemic got into meditation and read something about stoicism. And a lot of entrepreneurs, I think, adopt some of these kinds of thinking for similar reasons. A lot of it is about like non-attachment to results, right? What you can control is what you can control. You can control what you do. You can control to some extent how you make decisions and how you think about things. Not entirely, but to some extent. But you can't actually control the outcomes. And so during a period of what was very high uncertainty globally, I picked up a bit of a meditation practice to just kind of help center and just kind of reflect on the fact that, again, all you can do is all you can do. And that ended up being really useful to me. I still meditate regularly today. And, it's 10 minutes every day or two, but it makes a difference. And again, going back to what I said earlier about being self-aware and the importance of responding, not reacting, it helps you just kind of maintain that distance and being able to respond instead of reacting when things either go amazingly or go not so amazingly.
Yeah. Don't be too up when it's going real well, and don't be too down when it's not going so well. Meditation aside, what do you do in your spare time to relax?
I've got a bunch of different stuff that I do. My sport of choice is squash, which I absolutely love, and I play a few times a week. I bike ride a lot as well. As I mentioned earlier, Emmanuel and I both enjoy playing board games, love to travel. Those are probably the biggest things that I do for fun. Read a fair bit, including, I know there's some entrepreneurs that refuse to read fiction because they feel like it's a waste of time. I think we talked earlier. You made the comment, it's not a marathon and it's not a sprint, it's a series of sprints. I like that. I might actually steal that. I think you need to have that kind of downtime and recharge time, or else you're not going to be successful. And so that's always been really important to me.
We've got a lot of younger listeners, and if you could turn the clock back to when you started at U of T, is there any advice you'd give yourself?
Don't worry so much about planning everything out in advance. I think there's a tendency when you're first going to university to think that you've got to have everything figured out. You've got to have it figured out, like, what you're going to study, and then what job you're going to go do, and then where you want to live. And the reality is we all figure it out as we go. I don't think anyone really has all that figured out back then or follows the path that they thought they had laid out. And so just don't hold on to it too tightly. I've been really fortunate, and where I've made adjustments and said yes to opportunities and things like that, it's worked out really, really well. So I think that would probably be the biggest advice. The other thing that I think I'd say is, and this is something I did, but I'm really glad I did, do lots of stuff. Get involved in student politics, or join a ton of clubs, or join Toastmasters to learn how to do public speaking or whatever, but do lots of stuff, because that period when you're in college is your chance to figure out what you'd like. And the worst outcome is that you finish your degree and all you know is what you don't want to do. So do lots of stuff.
That's really good advice. When you think about your journey to date, what are you most proud of and why?
I'm incredibly proud of having built I'm not going to say a company, but built a team, like built an organization that is made up of absolutely incredible people that are trying to solve a real world problem, but also where we've had an impact on all of that team in really cool ways. Like, folks have developed in incredibly cool directions career-wise. We've got a married couple that met at Vive. We've got folks that are where we've seen their kids grow up, all while doing some really, really cool stuff that's having a real impact. I was at so I mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of Crop Life Canada, so they do an annual meeting every year, and it's called Grow Canada. And last year, the keynote speaker, whose name I've forgotten, so unfortunately I can't attribute this, said, when we look back on our careers, the work that we will look back the most fondly on is when we were doing hard things with people we like. And that's what we've been doing for 18 years. It's a lot of fun.
I read that when you talk about your company, you often describe it as a 100-year company?
Yeah,
Why?
so this comes back from something way back when we first started. Cynthia Goh, the professor whose lab we spun out of, will still tell this story sometimes. I don't know, the company was maybe 3 or 4 months old, something like that. We were just getting started. Somebody talked about, I don't know, selling the company to DuPont, I think was the company that we were talking about at the time. And apparently, and I don't remember this clearly, but apparently my reaction was, I don't want to sell to them. I want to be them. Realistically, I mean, we have shareholders and we're building something that's going to be massively valuable. And so I don't know whether we're going to end up still being around in 100 years. But if you go back and you look at the stories of how BASF got started or John Deere got started or like these companies got started just like us, and they got started building with real innovation and having a real impact. And that building something real is just so incredibly motivating to me. And so a big part
Yeah.
of what we try to do and try to talk about inside of Vive is how do you build a 100-year company? How do you build a company that is going to have that impact? And again, maybe at some point we end up selling the business to another company. We do that as part of another company or something like that. But it's about how do we make sure that we're handing down a better world to the next generation? I want what we've been building here at Vive to be part of handing that down and building something that has that impact of over 100 years. The 100-year company language, I know I've adopted from Peter Yilgen from Mattamy Homes. I heard him talk about that, and I really, really liked it. It's part of how they think about their business. I think it's a really useful way to think about building a company that's set up to have a massive impact over a long period of time.
Yeah, it's the long game, not the short game. I really like that concept. It struck me as well. So how is the company doing? You're 18 years in and heading in a wonderful direction from what I can see.
Yeah, no, we're in a great spot. We had products used in North America, branded products that we've developed used on over 1.6 million acres last year. We expect to be on over 2.5 million acres this year. We've got an incredibly deep R&D pipelines. We've got 44 assets that we've either launched or under development to launch between now and 2031. Launched one new product last year, one new product this year. 2026, we'll have 3 new products and 3 product expansions, and then 5 or more every year after that. So it's really exciting to be at that inflection point. But we're doing very, very well. And again, as I mentioned earlier, all you can do is all you can do. We certainly might have some surprises thrown at us over 18-year life. We've had a few of those, but right now we're cooking with gas.
Yeah. And it sounds like the flywheel effect is in full gear, which is great to hear. This has been so much fun speaking with you today, Darren. I really appreciate you making the time and having patience with me. We end all of our conversations on this podcast with the same question, which is this: what is the next great big idea on your horizon?
Whenever I wrap up my experience with Vive, and certainly we're doing enough fun stuff right now, I don't see that anytime in the near future. But one of the things that I'm incredibly excited about doing when I've got a little bit of bandwidth is really about how do we drive ag tech adoption in Canada, and how do we really try to set our country up to be successful in what is a massive opportunity that, in my opinion, we should be dominating globally. And so whether that's being involved in VC work or thought leadership, not-for-profit type stuff, I'm not entirely sure, but Canada should be owning the ag ecosystem. We should be owning ag tech globally, and we should be punching above our weights. And whatever I do, as I have some bandwidth at any point, will be related to helping Canada succeed on this playing field.
Well, I'm glad we've got you on our team, and I look forward to future announcements. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me. I've appreciated it.
That was Darren Anderson of Vive Crop Protection in Mississauga, Ontario. You can follow Darren on social at Darren J. Anderson, and if you'd like to learn more about Darren and the work he and his team are doing, please check out vivecrop.com. You can also follow them on social at ViveCrop. If you'd like to follow NGBI on social, you can find us at NGBideas and NGBI Summit And you can learn more about Canada's Life Sciences Summit at nextgreatbigideas.com. For details on what I do when I'm not hosting podcasts, please check out jim-wilson.ca and laboccupier.com. You can also follow me on social at laboccupier. This episode was researched by Zania Pinto and edited by No Limit Marketing. If you'd like to get in touch, email is best. My address is jwilson@leonard, that's LENNARD.com. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.